There's a question many Catholic women have asked in silence, without the courage to say it out loud, not even to their own priest. If she gets pregnant before marriage, will God turn away from her? And what the Church actually says about this is quite different from what most people imagine. And different, too, from what fear tends to whisper. If you're living through this situation right now, or you know someone who is, it's worth listening until the end, because the answer from Catholic doctrine completely changes how this moment should be faced. The first reaction almost always is fear. Fear of what the family will say, fear of the parish's judgment, fear of disappointing the parents who raised her in the faith. Then comes guilt, because she knows, she was taught since childhood, that the Church reserves sexual intimacy for marriage, that chastity isn't a whim, but part of God's plan for human love. And now, faced with her own body, this woman feels she has failed what she professed to believe. But there's a third force that mixes in with fear and guilt: love. Because in the midst of an unplanned pregnancy, even outside the context the faith teaches as ideal, an affection is born that no one programmed. And it's exactly at this point that the Catholic mind gets stuck on a question that catechesis often hasn't confronted head-on. If the sin is real, what does that mean for the child being formed? And what does it mean for her in the eyes of God? This question isn't foolish, nor is it the naivety of someone who doesn't know the doctrine. It's the question that has crossed centuries of moral theology, and it does have an answer, one the Church has formulated with precision, but one that rarely reaches clearly those who need to hear it most. Before answering, it's necessary to understand a distinction that changes everything, separating what happened from what the person is, and separating the act from the fruit of that act. This distinction is the center of everything that follows. The Catechism of the Catholic Church is clear about sexual relations outside of marriage. It is considered a grave sin because it wounds God's design for human sexuality, which only finds its full meaning within the marital covenant, open to life and to the total gift between spouses. The Church does not soften this, and pretending otherwise would be misleading anyone watching this video. But here's the point many people confuse, even within the Church itself. The sin belongs to the act of the parents, never to the child conceived. There is no idea, in Catholic doctrine, that a pregnancy outside marriage is a punishment sent by God. God does not use a human life as an instrument of punishment. This is a serious theological distortion, and it needs to be corrected in no uncertain terms. The child being formed carries, from the very first instant of conception, a soul and a dignity that nothing, not even the circumstances of its beginning, can diminish. The Church has always insisted on this, even in centuries when the surrounding society treated illegitimacy as a social stain. While entire cultures stigmatized children born outside of marriage, Catholic doctrine maintained, at least in its official teaching, that no child is born less loved by God because of the sin of its parents. The sin belongs to the adults who acted. Baptismal grace and human dignity belong to the child without restriction. And what about the woman? Here's another point many Catholics have never heard explained honestly. The Church doesn't exist to exclude sinners. It exists to reconcile them. The sacrament of confession was instituted exactly for this, so that no one has to carry the weight of a sin alone, however real that sin may be. Jesus, in the Gospel of John chapter 8, faced with a woman caught in adultery, doesn't deny the sin, doesn't pretend it didn't happen, but also doesn't condemn her to exclusion. He says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." This phrase sums up the balance the Church has tried to maintain for 2,000 years. Truth about the sin, mercy toward the person. This means a woman pregnant outside of marriage remains fully part of the Church, can and should seek confession when she recognizes the fault, and does not lose access to the sacraments because she is pregnant. The pregnancy itself is not a sin to be confessed. The act that preceded it can be brought to confession, yes, but the life that results from it is always a good, never an additional guilt. Here the narrative changes direction, because the experience of many women in this situation is not one of definitive distance from God, but quite the opposite, an unexpected return to faith. The Church's tradition holds concrete examples of how human failing can become a starting point for holiness, not because sin is good, but because God's mercy is greater than it. King David, after committing adultery with Bathsheba and plotting the death of her husband, is confronted by the prophet Nathan and publicly acknowledges his guilt. Psalm 51, attributed to David at that moment, became one of the most used prayers of repentance in the entire history of Christian liturgy. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. David was not cast aside by God after his fall. On the contrary, his story of conversion became a model for every repentant sinner. Another well-documented historical example is St. Augustine. Before his conversion, Augustine lived for years outside the moral principles he would later defend as a bishop and doctor of the Church, and had a son, Deodatus, outside of marriage. Augustine never hid this. He himself recounts this phase of his life in his Confessions. And what's most relevant for anyone watching this video? Augustine doesn't treat his son as the fruit of a curse, but speaks of him with affection and admiration, calling him a gift received despite his own mistakes. Augustine's conversion, also nurtured by the tireless prayers of his mother, Saint Monica, became one of the greatest examples of divine mercy in the whole history of Christianity. These examples don't exist to minimize sin, but to show something the Church has always taught, and that often gets lost in hurried preaching. The fall is not the end of the story with God. Sacramental confession, when sought with true contrition, restores the soul to grace, and the woman who goes through this experience often describes the pregnancy as the trigger that brought her back to the practice of the faith, not what drove her away from it. Regardless of how the conception happened, the Church is categorical on one point. Human life, once begun, possesses infinite and inviolable dignity. The Catechism teaches that this dignity does not depend on the circumstances, the will of the parents, or the social conditions in which the child is conceived. It is intrinsic to the fact of existing as a person created in the image and likeness of God. This means that the woman, in deciding to welcome this life, is not merely fulfilling a moral obligation to preserve the pregnancy. She is being called to live, even in imperfect circumstances, the maternal vocation that the faith itself recognizes as one of the highest forms of collaboration with the work of God. Motherhood, even begun outside the ideal order established by the Church, doesn't stop being real motherhood, carrying the same spiritual weight and the same call to self-giving. Many women report that it is exactly during this period that faith stops being a set of rules inherited from childhood and becomes a personal relationship with God. The need to care for another life, to take on concrete responsibility, tends to mature one's spirituality in a way the previous routine didn't. Divine providence, a recurring theme in the writings of saints like Sainte Thérèse of Lisieux and Saint Josemaria Escrivá, is often described as something that reveals itself precisely in the moments when life didn't follow the expected script. Returning to the question that gave rise to this video, what actually happens to a Catholic woman who gets pregnant before marriage? The doctrinal answer is this: she does not stop being loved by God, she is not excluded from the Church, she does not carry a permanent mark of rejection, and the child she bears is, under no circumstances, the fruit of a divine punishment. What actually happens depends, according to Catholic teaching, on the response this woman gives to what she has lived through, not on the fact itself. There are two possible paths in the face of this reality. The first is drawing away. Shame, fear of others' judgment, or poorly processed guilt can lead someone to distance themselves from the Church exactly when they need it most. The second path is conversion, acknowledging the sin without denying it, seeking confession when possible, welcoming the life conceived as a gift, and allowing this experience to become the beginning of a more mature and truer relationship with God. The Church, through its doctrine, the Gospels, the saints, and the Catechism, insistently points toward the second path, not because it minimizes the gravity of the sin, but because it knows, through revelation itself, that God's mercy is greater than any human fall. As Jesus himself said to the adulterous woman, there is no condemnation, there is a call to move forward without repeating the mistake. This is the true outcome that the Catholic faith proposes: truth about sin, welcome toward the person, absolute dignity for the life conceived, and a path always open for whoever decides to return.